Thanks, Catherine, and hello, everybody. Again, my name is Jesse Morris. I'm a principal in the electricity practice of Rocky Mountain Institute and a co-founder of the Energy Web Foundation. So thanks again, InfoCast, for inviting us to put on this webinar together. And as Catherine said, please do take a look at that Q&A section on the right. We're going to be collecting those questions and leave plenty of time at the end of this presentation to address as many of them as possible. Before we jump into the content, just wanted to show everyone what I plan to cover with this webinar. The first, a little bit of perspective on how we look at the changing grid. Second, exactly where we think blockchains, and by extension, this new organization, the Energy Web Foundation, fits into that changing ecosystem. Third, I'll provide just a brief update on exactly what we're doing with this organization called Energy Web Foundation. And then again, we'll plan to leave about 15 minutes, perhaps more, for a Q&A at the end. So that's what we have planned for the next 45 minutes. Next slide, please. So without spending too much time level setting, because we know we have a lot of smart people on this webinar, just a couple of simple slides to show where we look at the electricity sector, how we look at the electricity sector, and again, how we came to consider blockchains. So at a high level, we really see the economic advantage shifting in the electricity sector. On this slide, you see the yellow arrow. That's really trying to show our generalization of the traditional centralized electricity infrastructure in the developed world that, from our perspective, is really characterized by flat or falling electricity demand, increasing peak to off-peak ratios, generally speaking, underutilized assets, and again, as shown by that yellow arrow, increasing costs. And yet on the other side, if we look at the blue arrow going down, we really see a new future characterized largely by distributed energy resources and end users of electricity. So this is an ecosystem characterized by dramatic cost declines that I'm sure folks on this webinar are familiar with, aggressive shifts in customer adoption of specific distributed energy resources, and generally speaking, a focus on investments and capital that is focused on economies of scope, not necessarily on economies of scale. So using investments in distributed energy resources to meet the actual needs of the electricity infrastructure instead of making large investments focused on economies of scale. So a couple of characteristics that we see in this shift. Next slide, please. Going a little bit deeper on this shift, we really see the shift in terms of where we spend capital and where value lies as going away from where the value has traditionally been in the electricity infrastructure, so generation, transmission, and distribution, and towards investments potentially behind the customer meter or close to it. The talking point that many raise is that we're planning in North America, in the United States, to spend 1.3 trillion on infrastructure in the electricity sector. And that 1.3 trillion traditionally goes to the three areas flagged on this slide on the top part of it. One of the big questions we ask at Energy Web Foundation and at Rocky Mountain Institute is, what kind of value can we unlock from shifting some of that capital to this other side of the meter? And what kind of implications does that have for the way we operate and invest in the electricity grid? So again, just a little bit of framing on this topic. The next slide, please. Here's the trick. We have a problem. If that value, if that capital is indeed shifting to more distributed energy resources, to more customer-focused solutions, we don't have an architecture that's necessarily capable of handling that. So on the left, a very simple description of our existing legacy architecture, one-way flow of power and one-way flow of money between utilities and customers as shown by the arrows. In this emerging system architecture, we still generally are thinking about wholesale markets and wholesale participants, thousands of them at that wholesale level. The big change is the relationship between there and what we're calling a distribution edge, where we could have potentially millions or billions of devices and participants in the system where the flow of energy and power is two-way, as is the flow of value and money. So this emerging system architecture is very much something we think is where we are moving towards. But if we show the next slide, There are three big issues that we need to address for this architecture to manifest. There are probably more, but these are some of the big ones that we tend to focus on. The first is cybersecurity. How do we truly connect billions of energy-using devices to our electricity system and maintain a robust defense against cyber threats? Second, how do we keep the transactional costs of such an ecosystem, of such an architecture low? It's very challenging. And third, how do we ensure that all of these different devices are actually delivering services to other devices or to grid operators in the way that they say they're going to? And the way I characterize that now is, how do we basically enable these devices to use smart contracts to validate that they're able to deliver these services at the right time? So we looked at these issues, lots of different questions around them, and if we go to the next slide, we developed a pretty strong hypothesis, and that's that blockchains are able to address all three of these issues and more, and that, in a nutshell, is why we've launched this organization called Energy Web Foundation, in recognition of that hypothesis and this high-level storyline. Next slide, please. So that's, again, high-level perspective on how we see the grid changing. Could go on and on with hours of presentations on that. But what we'd like to spend the time on is really talking about blockchains and this organization we started called Energy Web Foundation. So let's go to the next slide and jump in there. Our mission is pretty simple and shown on the left here. We aim to foster value creation in the energy sector by promoting an open, decentralized software infrastructure that's built around blockchain technology. So how do we go about achieving that mission? I've shown the 4 ways we're really working against that on the right, and this is what I'm going to spend most of my time talking through. The first is focused on the applications themselves. As folks on this webinar are likely aware, blockchain is at peak hype in the news cycle, and the confluence of blockchain and energy is approaching a second peak hype, if you ask me. So one of the things we do with the foundation is to go beyond that hype, understand which applications have real commercial value behind them, and then work with our affiliate organizations to help them develop businesses and applications around those things that have real value. The second is about supporting those applications. We are actually building a blockchain specific to the energy sector, and it will be an open source blockchain upon which we envision thousands or millions of different applications running on top of. So that's the second thing I'll talk about. The third is in recognition of the fact that there is a rich ecosystem of users, application developers, and infrastructure providers at the nexus of blockchain and energy. And we're trying to use Energy Web Foundation to serve as the platform to connect all of those various market participants. Finally, blockchains are quite confusing, and some of their implications are even more confusing. One of the things we plan to do with Energy Web Foundation is to provide that education function to the marketplace to help regulators and other stakeholders really understand what this technology is capable of and what the various implications thereof could be. So let's jump in on these 4 things. The next slide, please. A brief moment on our governance structure. So Energy Web Foundation has an advisory board that is comprised of various affiliate organizations that I'll talk about in a moment. And that advisory board advises the Energy Web Foundation Council, which is shown here. The Foundation Council has 5 seats currently. 2 are held by RMI representatives, as you can see on here, and 2 are held by our technology partners at Grid Singularity, shown on this slide. The 5th representative, the 5th member of the Foundation Council currently is Christoph Frey, Secretary General of the World Energy Council, and he is our neutral 5th member of the Foundation Council. So this is our governance structure, and if we go to the next slide, we can show who our first set of 10 affiliates were to join us. So these, I'm not going to read through them, but these are the 10 electricity market participants, again, a worldwide subset of that set of companies who joined us in our initial advisory board. So these are our first 10 affiliates. We're very proud to be working with them on all of the different pieces that I'm about to describe, but that should give you an idea of some of the companies that we're working with initially. Next slide. Back to this concept of applications and going beyond the hype. We've identified about 184 potential applications of blockchain in the energy sector. They're shown on this slide, and we kind of characterize them in two ways. One is basically thinking about how blockchains might optimize existing business processes, ranging from just communications protocols to billing. On the right, another way to think about blockchain is how they might be used to facilitate new platforms for value exchange. One of the things that is talked about often is this, quote, peer-to-peer use case or application. I'm not going to spend much time on that for the purposes of this call, but if that's something you've heard about in the news, that is where that kind of application would fit in. But for us, it was really hard to understand at this incredibly high level which of these applications were actually worthwhile and valuable. So if we go to the next slide, we've culled that list of 184 and narrowed in on 7 much more specific, what we call application domains. And let me walk through them very quickly just to give you an idea of where we think there is some real value. The first is focus on billing. That is, what would happen? What kind of value would be unlocked if you used a blockchain to manage customers, customer meters, automate billing, and use cryptographic identities, generally speaking, to manage that whole system? That's one of the first application domains. The second is around certificates of origin. So what happens if, using a blockchain, renewable generators create certificates? Those certificates are issued, traded, tracked, redeemed, and retired on a blockchain. What kind of value is unlocked? What additional applications does that enable? The third has to do with demand response. What happens, or what would happen, if demand response aggregators use secure smart contracts to, for example, conduct instant measurement and verification and settlement? So testing hypotheses around blockchains and demand response. The fourth is around this concept of metered energy efficiency, very similar to demand response, essentially using smart contracts to facilitate deeper penetrations and easier financing of various energy efficiency investments. So that's what that application domain is about. Fifth, electric vehicles. There have been some action in the marketplace led by Energy, a company in Europe, if folks have not heard of this, considering how you can manage electric vehicles and electric vehicle supply infrastructure on a blockchain. What kind of value is unlocked by doing that? Finally, number 6, this concept of transactive energy. How could a blockchain support a new grid architecture and a new market designs that essentially balance and control the grid using very specific temporal and locational price signals to this concept of transactive energy? And finally, this goes a little bit beyond pure energy applications, but asking the question for how can utilities or third parties use cryptographic identities to validate and track assets? So think about wind turbine gearboxes, transformers, to understand the history of those assets and where they've been. So again, 7 application areas we've identified. If we go to the next slide, what we're doing right now with our affiliates is doubling down on these 4. We've launched what we call task forces, which is focused on helping our affiliate organizations understand these applications in great detail. And that's really just an example of the work we're doing within these task forces right now. So that's that. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk about the technology itself. So what we just talked about was at the application layer, at the yellow shown on this chart. So these are, we envision companies developing and coding applications at that layer. They might have to do with certificates of origin, they might have to do with transactive energy, you name it. What we believe at Energy Web Foundation is that the content shown in blue on this chart is the kind of work and the kind of technology that should be open source, is frankly quite challenging to develop, and should be kind of in the realm of a nonprofit organization. So that is what we are bringing to the market with Energy Web Foundation. We are building a blockchain, the blockchain infrastructure focused specifically on the energy sector in order to support development of applications on top of that blockchain. So if we go to the next slide, a little bit more detail here. The first thing to talk about with this is just the cash cost of going it alone. We really do think the way forward is to unite. Based on our benchmark of the marketplace, if companies are looking to do proof of concepts, if they're looking to do pilots in support of minimum viable products, you need a blockchain to put those products on top of. And blockchains out there, the Bitcoin blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, obviously companies can develop applications on top of those, but we don't believe that those blockchains are necessarily scalable enough to really meet the needs of the electricity sector. We can speak more about that later. So many companies are looking at building their own private blockchains, and those do have a significant cash cost to them. Furthermore, outside of cash, there are some significant opportunity costs of, quote, going it alone. Duplication, there's a lot of work being done many times over. If companies go the route of doing these private blockchains on their own, nobody is necessarily leveraging the frankly scarce amount of technical talent that's out there as it relates to blockchain and energy. It's avoiding the opportunity to collectively invest in the infrastructure that everyone could take advantage of. There's not much of a concerted effort as it relates to regulatory changes or standards. There's no collective experiment in governance, which is very crucial to blockchain technology. And perhaps most importantly, there's not currently a lot of cross-learning going on across different peer organizations that are experimenting with blockchain and energy. So one way we look at the reasoning we should come together and unite. The last slide on the core technology will be the next one. Just showing our timeline, it's quite aggressive. So we'll be deploying the initial starting point for our blockchain with our affiliate organizations in about September of this year. Between then and Q1 of next year, where we host our Event Horizon conference, we're going to be releasing additional features on top of that alpha version in support of a beta. And then between then and Q1 2019, we will continue to release additional features on top of the basic blockchain until we actually go live and create the Genesis block of our blockchain. So that's the high-level timeline of how we're approaching this. And again, much more detail I can share offline or later on how we're looking at this core tech. Next slide, please. The first one we talked about applications. The second, we talked about building the infrastructure to support those applications. The third is about the people in the organizations who can actually build them. So on this slide, I was shocked to learn this several months ago, but there's something like 100 companies, including many startups, in the marketplace today that offer some combination of either consulting services or the ability to actually code and develop applications focused on kind of this nexus of blockchain and energy. Some of those companies are profiled here. And one of the things we are just starting with Energy Web Foundation is basically creating a web-based platform that will connect our affiliate organizations with these startups, either through simple transactional mechanisms like RFPs, perhaps other events that we may host in the realm of this ecosystem. So think hackathons focused on very specific application domains, et cetera. So again, this ecosystem is very important to us, and we would like to play the function of the connective tissue between basically the buyers and sellers of this technology and these services. The next slide, please. The final benefit I just want to talk through, and I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, has to do with stakeholder education. As I said before, blockchains are incredibly confusing on their own, and when they start getting conflated or combined with potential value add in energy, it gets even more confusing. So we're going to use Energy Web Foundation to provide some education functions to the various stakeholder groups outlined here. So just a flavor of some of the groups that we're targeting. And in terms of what we'll be delivering, if we go to the next slide, some of those products are shown here. On the left, these are general awareness-focused products that will be available to not just our affiliates and the startups that are a part of this ecosystem, but truly the general public. So this includes thought leadership, blogs, our annual conference that we put on called the Event Horizon, et cetera. You can see what those kinds of deliverables take. We're also considering on the right specific trainings. We've been approached by a number of universities and certificate programs thinking about how we might work with them to put together very tailored trainings because this is such a growing space. But then also outside of that, more simple things, hackathons, online courses, workshops or trainings focused on our blockchain. So again, that's just the summary of that piece around education and helping everyone understand what this technology is capable of. Can we go to the next slide? Before we go to question and answer, we just want to give a little bit of a brief status update in terms of where we are to help folks on this webinar understand what the next steps are, et cetera. So next slide, please. Here's where we stand. Today, August 1st, we opened a second contribution round. So we are now accepting signed MOUs that I'll talk about on the next slide and bringing on new affiliates to Energy Web Foundation. We have a pipeline of about 100 companies from markets across the globe that are evaluating whether or not to join us at this point in time. That round continues, and in the meantime, we'll be carrying on, moving right on this slide with ongoing task force work. So to go deeper on those application domains to help our affiliates truly understand what is possible with blockchain technology, and we'll be releasing that alpha version of the core technology. After that, I've highlighted our Event Horizon conference. This is a second annual conference. So we did our first in Vienna in February of this year. We'll be doing a second location and details TBD, but it should be in the first quarter of 2018, second annual Energy Focused Blockchain Conference. The third thing to flag is we will be releasing additional functionality and features, and those features are directly informed by our task forces. That is, our task forces are doing ongoing work on technical architecture and a number of other things as it relates to those task forces, and then those immediately provide feedback to our core technology so that we know which features we need to be developing on that energy blockchain infrastructure. Finally, we do plan for our Energy Web Foundation blockchain to go live in the first quarter of 2019, and we'll do that likely using something called a public token sale. And again, the timeline on that is about Q1 of 2019. So that's where we are in the process. If we go to the final slide here, just wanted the very self-serving, the process of how to join us. Send us an email. There's one on there. It just says join@energyweb.org. We have a lot of documents that we'll then share with you as it relates to everything I've covered on this webinar and more. And then we can start accepting signed MOUs as of this date. The only other thing I'll note on the next slide, or I'm sure we can follow up, I have my email for Energy Web Foundation. If you don't want to just send it to the generic one, I'm more than happy to field inquiries directly to my email, which will be shown in a moment. Okay, so that is, I think if we go to the next slide, I believe that was all the content we have. Yep, and there is my email address, so please jot it down. Any questions? We're looking for everyone to collaborate with in this space. So let me stop there. And Catherine, do we have some questions?
Yes, we do. All right, let's start with Ruben just asked, are there competing or parallel energy blockchain consortiums? If so, what is the difference between Energy Web Foundation and those?
Great question. So I'm going to very politically answer this in that, and honestly, we do not like to position ourselves as a competitor in this space because we're a nonprofit, and just speaking personally, I come from Rocky Mountain Institute, so our entire effort is aimed at just accelerating the global economy's transition to away from our current system focused on centralized thermal power plants to one based on efficiency and renewables. And the reason we launched Energy Web Foundation was in pursuit of that vision. That being said, and that caveat, there are other efforts in the blockchain and energy space. So that the one that I'd really like to call to attention, folks are probably familiar with Hyperledger. Hyperledger is a non-industry specific blockchain that is out there. And there are a number of companies considering how that Hyperledger project might be used in support of energy applications. And so we think that's great. We've spoken with folks from the Linux Foundation, who houses the Hyperledger initiative, and a couple of other the technical folks on that team. And frankly, we're still looking for ways to work together with that initiative. It's unclear how that's going to roll out right now, but that's certainly the other initiative in the space where energy is being discussed explicitly. And I would encourage folks on this webinar to go and check out what they're doing in the space. I'll also answer the question around the difference. The difference really has to do with where we're starting from a core technology perspective. Our blockchain is going to involve contributions from a number of different participants and technology providers in the blockchain space. Those include Parity, two other startups in the blockchain space called Slock.it and Brainbot, and then also our partners at Grid Singularity. And frankly, we'll likely involve many other technology vendors to bring in some of their IP into our core technology. That being said, we are starting with the Ethereum blockchain as a starting point for our core tech. Essentially, what we're doing is taking the Ethereum public blockchain, and we'll be using a different consensus mechanism called proof of authority that I can share detail on later without going down too much of a rabbit hole. That's going to be the start of our test network, of our alpha platform, and then we'll be building additional features on top of that. So that was probably more than was asked for by the question, but that's at least the starting point.
Well, thank you so much for your thorough answer, Jesse, and thank you, Ruben, for your question. All right, so we're going to move on to another one. Michael asks, have you completed valuations to the utility customer for any of the blockchain use cases?
Great question. So we are in process on that right now. For example, I showed the 4 application domains, and an additional 3 were shown on that slide. We don't need to pull it back up, Catherine, but there were 7 shown. We have done some high-level kind of valuation work to understand at the application level. For example, if a blockchain-based solution was used to manage customer accounts and automate billing, how much, quote, value would that unlock for a utility using automated meter reading? How much value would that unlock for a utility that actually has full AMI and smart meter deployment? We've started to do some of those exercises. We don't have anything we can share publicly yet, but let it be known that we are working on a public-facing, quote, application catalog that we're going to release that will have some of that market sizing information. I can't give you a time on that, but we're aiming for kind of a fall, early winter release to the general public that will have some of those initial valuations.
Okay, great. So Matt also asks, you mentioned scalability as a big concern. Speaking broadly, what elements of your contemplated blockchain architecture allow you to achieve scalability?
Great question. I'll give a two-pronged answer in terms of the elements. So the first element is the consensus mechanism itself. Proof of authority, I'd recommend maybe just typing it in. There's a great page on GitHub that has some detail on proof of authority. Basically, the concept is folks on this webinar likely understand what proof of work is, the consensus mechanism behind blockchains such as Bitcoin. People probably also have heard about proof of stake, which is the consensus mechanism that's being put up for other blockchains to consider moving to. Both of those blockchains use a pretty significant amount of energy, especially proof of work, both of those approaches to consensus, because there's a lot of mining that takes place. Well, the way to think about proof of authority is that essentially Energy Web Foundation in this initial phase is going to whitelist certain authorities to become nodes on our blockchain, and then those nodes will be called upon to perform the validation function. What do you get by doing that? Well, now we're not wasting energy on solving the hashing algorithm behind, for example, Bitcoin or Ethereum. So much less energy is expended on maintaining the immutability and the state of the blockchain. That's a huge benefit of this proof of authority approach. Again, maybe just check out, use Google, go read more about proof of authority if you haven't already. The second comment on scalability is just about how many transactions per second can we handle. Just consider for a moment, we did a back of the envelope exercise to think about rooftop solar customers in the United States. If all of them were basically exchanging value, or at least their exported electricity from their solar systems was being tracked, just again on existing rooftop solar customers in the US, and you were basically tracking those transactions on a 5-minute basis, you end up with needing a platform that can handle 1 million transactions per second. And that's with one very limited application of blockchain technology. None of the blockchains that are out there are necessarily capable of handling 1 million transactions per second. And that's not even considering the fact that there are other solutions here. Do we really need 5-minute communications being transacted on a regular basis for that? That's a different question. We're dealing with that a number of ways. We're looking at off-chain solutions, so people have likely heard of the Lightning Network or the Raiden Network, and integrating those kinds of technological solutions with our blockchain. But there's more detail we'll be able to share on that moving forward on exactly how we're dealing with scalability. But those are two that come to mind immediately, is off-chain transactions, and a lot of work is being done on that with the Raiden Network and Lightning Networks.
Great, thank you so much, Jesse. All right, guys, I please encourage you to continue asking questions. I'm getting a lot of great questions here. So Tom asks, why do you need to raise capital via an ICO as opposed to a venture capital source?
Great question. So first of all, the token generation event, the public token sale, we're still finalizing the structure on it, and folks probably saw the SEC ruling on how they're considering the valuation of companies that use blockchains and how to consider them. So we're still ironing out the details of how that Genesis block event will happen in 2019. In terms of why we're doing that, let's step back from the capitalization approach for a moment. We at RMI thought it was really important for a nonprofit to be the company that is behind this technology and this approach and this initiative. With that, and the reasons for that should be relatively clear based on the presentation I gave. We want a neutral third party who is mission driven in terms of not being profit driven, but being driven about bringing this technology to the energy sector, because we believe it can unlock a lot of value. So naturally, that sort of screams nonprofit, right? Can a venture capital fund do, can venture capitalists and other kinds of capital flow into a nonprofit using that traditional VC approach? No. So we were looking for a different way by which to raise funds to perform the work of the foundation. And so that's how we've settled on this contribution approach, where we are having affiliates contribute to the Energy Web Foundation upfront instead of doing, again, a venture capital approach. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me just say that one more time, though. We are a nonprofit organization, and that's how we're structured. So we're not a business.
Thank you so much for your answer. Tom also asks, why do you need tokens? Why can't users sell electricity for fiat currency through a blockchain?
I'm really glad somebody asked that. So I'm going to answer both parts of that question because there's a lot buried in there. The reason you use tokens for a blockchain is that it's a very elegant, natural way to pay the transactional costs of the network. So what do I mean by that? Let's say that Tom and I have a flexible electric hot water heater, and he is a grid operator. And he basically wants to send a price signal to me for me to tamp down or crank up when my electric water heater turns on. So that's kind of a traditional utility demand response program, right? Let's say we're doing it with the blockchain. Well, when the grid operator sends that price signal, or when my IoT device verifies that my water heater responded, there is a, quote, computation that happens, right? There is some computer code being run in that transaction. We have to pay for the network to run that computer code in some way, shape, or form. So that's what our token is being used for on this blockchain. These tokens have nothing to do with the amount of value being exchanged. It purely has to do with the computational cost of running that transaction on the network. So that's part one. That's why we're using tokens. But there was a second question buried in there that I think I heard correctly, which is why not just use fiat currency to pay that transactional cost? Two-part answer. The first is if you've experimented or actually kind of gotten hands-on with blockchain technology, one of the ways you get that immutability quality and you get that ability to basically track the security, or sorry, not track, to enhance the security of the system, it's by using this tokenization approach. It's pretty difficult to do that tokenization approach and tie it directly to fiat currency. It's just a little bit more of a natural, elegant solution to do it with a, quote, wallet-based approach that uses a crypto, not necessarily a cryptocurrency, but a token to track the payment of all of these different things. So more detail to have there. A simple way I like to think about it is if you're transacting with a customer, do you really want to know everything about their transactional history, associate their personality and their address separately with a credit card account or rely on checks? Or would you rather have them have a cryptographic identity that's associated with a wallet, and that wallet can be charged with different kinds of tokens, and those tokens could be procured without the customer having to think twice about whether or not they're using dollars or they're using tokens. I'm not suggesting that customers are going to go out and buy tons of different kinds of cryptocurrency and use those cryptocurrencies to pay for their electricity. Most of what I'm describing would happen on the back end, and again, these cryptographic identities and associated tokens are just a more elegant, more efficient way of tracking how much customers spend on their energy.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your answer, Jesse. And thank you, Tom, for your great questions. All right, moving on to Jason. So Jason asks, are there any regulatory roadblocks regarding the energy industry utilizing blockchain?
The simple answer is, of course. As with any new technology, there's a lot of challenges. So I could go off on this answer for a long time. Let me just reel it back by raising two specific ones. In every market across the globe, in the developed economies, there is a varying level of openness, or maybe openness is the wrong word, varying levels of ways for capital to be deployed against things like distributed energy resources. For example, in the US, if I'm a vertically integrated utility in a regulated market, I am currently incentivized, and my regulators even expect me to make investments in things like distribution infrastructure, transformers, reconductoring lines, etc. When in fact, as we believe at EnergyWeb and Rocky Mountain Institute, there are definitely situations where utilities would be better served to take that capital and spend it on so-called non-wires services or non-wires alternatives. So that means taking capital that would have been spent on transformers and spending it on things like batteries, things like demand response programs, things like energy efficiency. So that is a regulatory challenge, right? Because those utilities are currently being sent a signal that they should not invest in those kinds of assets. And that regulatory challenge has nothing to do with blockchains. That has everything to do with distributed energy resources. So all of those challenges that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis having to do with cost of service regulation in the electricity sector, blockchains are not solving that problem. We still have that problem. So that's one way to think about it. On the other side, we do envision specific to blockchains, there will be regulatory challenges and barriers. I don't claim to have a crystal ball to say what all of those are. As I showed in our presentation, that's one of the 4 big pieces of work we plan to do, is to identify all of those regulatory barriers in specific markets and help educate stakeholder groups and overcome some of them. So that's kind of the softball answer on the second piece. But suffice it to say, this is not going to be a walk in the park.
Thanks, Jesse. All right, so I also have a question here from Julio, and he asks, is the Energy Web Foundation platform planning to use proprietary technology?
Great question. All of our, I'll just, a very simple answer. The blockchain itself is going to be open source and available to the public under a GPL 3 license, so general public license, in perpetuity. And that commitment is found throughout our incorporation documents, throughout our bylaws. It's everywhere. So that's hopefully a simple answer.
Thank you. All right. So please forgive me if I say this wrong, but Jyoti asks, can you please talk a little bit about blockchain to manage utility billing? Does it require additional hardware to the smart meter?
Just writing that down. So first, whoever asked that question, you should join us and get on our billing task force so you can get hands-on with that, because these are exactly the questions we're exploring. As to your question specifically with hardware, the answer is no. Can you take an existing data stream coming from smart meters and basically create a cryptographic identity for each of those smart meters, and they're basically treated as, to use some additional blockchain jargon, oracles, right? So they're verified devices that have a data stream that is then sent through the blockchain. That is an architecture that is possible, right, with no additional hardware necessarily being deployed. However, from a first principles perspective, if you were to design, for example, a smart meter-based customer billing system from scratch, how would you do it, especially as it relates to cybersecurity? You would probably have those devices speaking directly to the blockchain instead of going through the existing utilities SCADA protocol and then onto the blockchain, because in that architecture I just described, where those smart meters are communicating directly with the blockchain, you have to then go, a malicious actor would have to go and attack each of those smart meters, whereas the vulnerability point in the former architecture without additional hardware has a single greater vulnerability point, and that is the utilities existing billing system. So a simple answer, many more nuances to be docked through there, but hopefully that helps.
Thank you. All right, so this is a kind of a quick question, but Nick is wondering, is there a plan to release a technical white paper or any other technical documents? Or are there any other technical documents available for them to check out?
Great question. So we are in process on developing a number of documents for public consumption. That includes the application catalog I described earlier, a larger piece of thought leadership trying to connect this whole concept of transactive energy with blockchains. The technical white paper is undergoing review and work right now. Can't give a timeline on that. I just suggest following our website, the EWF website. We're going to be updating that regularly with content updates, etc. You could also keep an eye on the Rocky Mountain Institute blog, and we're also pretty active with most of the other clean tech publications. So when those documents are made available, we'll try and communicate it as broadly as possible. If you are looking for resources, the two I would point towards, the DENA, D-E-N-A, the German Energy Agency, did put out a white paper kind of cataloging a number of their use cases and applications that they've profiled. The other one I would point to is Ernst & Young, I believe, released a white paper detailing their kind of perspective on blockchain and energy. So those are two kind of initial resources I'd go check out.
Thank you so much. All right, so let's see. There's a lot of questions coming in here, and we really, really appreciate your participation. So thank you. I'm just going to start saying names. Thank you to Hazel, Lori, Jonathan, Diego, David. We're going to get through all of these. I'll send them to Jesse. So I'm just going to start wrapping up with a couple of closing questions. So James asks a really great question. He asks, will or are the incumbents in the existing value chain, generation, distribution, and retail, are they embracing your vision, and are they participating?
Excellent question. Simplest answer would probably be to look at the existing affiliate list. Some of those incumbents are on there. So TWL is I think we have a mostly North American audience. So TWL is the equivalent of basically a municipal utility in the US, and they're in Germany. They are an incumbent. And I'd like to share something I heard from them, which is we don't believe, we're still looking for our business model of the future, and we don't believe we're going to be selling electrons. We think we are likely to be disrupted, and we'd like to understand how blockchains will enable us to be that core platform provider for electricity service while relying on other parties to deliver the actual goods. So I'd say many companies sit in that incumbent position now, and they're looking to blockchains for new ways that they can provide services to their customers. So that's really exciting. I'd say some of our other affiliates who are also incumbents realize some of the disruptive potential that comes along with things like distributed energy resources in general, and their investigation into blockchains really has to do with understanding A, how they could be disrupted, and then B, can they get in front of that disruption by embracing this technology and understanding how they might be able to offer some of those services that the disruptors were thinking about offering in the first place. So they are participating. I would be lying if I said that every conversation I have with a potential affiliate is an easy one. Many companies are incredibly skeptical, not just about blockchains, but about everything I talked about in the beginning of my presentation, this whole coming, quote, revolution in distributed energy resources. So of course, not everybody believes that. So not everybody is on the bandwagon, but you'd be surprised how many and what kinds of companies are interested in exploring this technology.
Well, actually, that was a great transition because I think another great question is Wade had asked, what are the commitments from the large corporations to become an affiliate with EnergyWeb?
Great. So they're twofold. One is a financial contribution. It's a one-time contribution that I don't want to just talk about it on the webinar right now because there's some nuance and detail behind that. So please do reach out to me and we can go into much more detail, lots of documentation on this. But outside of the financial contribution, which is one time, there is another contribution, then that is on the human side. We don't expect affiliate organizations to be assigning full-time resources against any of the work that I've described thus far. And that includes things like setting up the node for our blockchain within your companies. That includes participating on our Slack channels to give feedback on the different features that we're developing. However, the affiliates that get most out of this are the ones that put human bodies and resources against working with us on some of these task forces and answering some of the detailed questions like the ones that have come up against this webinar. So there's no commitment on the human resource side, but I would say that the affiliates that get most out of their contribution to EWF are the ones that actually have some percentage of some of their staff actively working with us on the various activities. So that's that answer. And on the financial side, please just do reach out to me. I can share the detail on exactly what that contribution looks like.
Okay, perfect. And so I think this is a good last question. So Lori asks, is there actually a minimum amount to join for round B? I think they'd like to contribute.
Yes, there is a minimum amount. And again, I just want to be able to communicate that with the documentation because it's a bit confusing, and there is a minimum amount.
All right, perfect. So I think we're going to just end with that. Thank you, everyone. I'll make sure to send these questions to Jesse. Thank you, Jesse, for answering all these questions. I'm sure everyone really appreciated it.